Professor Laffin, can you hear me? Yeah. As the senior historian on the panel, how would you account for the fact that Irish women like Alice Milligan have been written out of history? Why have they been ignored for so long?
I'm afraid it wasn't just in Ireland that women were written out of the record, written out of positions of power and influence. Remember, women didn't get the vote until 1918 in the United Kingdom. Elsewhere, the pattern was very much worse. In France, 1946. In Switzerland, 1971, at national level. So,
New Zealand in 1894.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it was a very long run. But Europe, I'm afraid, was somewhat behind. And there was a comfortable male chauvinist attitude of superiority. Women can take over when the men aren't able to perform. They might be in jail or at war or whatever. But remember that in the Republic of Ireland, there was no female member of a cabinet between 1921 and 1979. It was only when Charles Haughey appointed Máire Geoghegan Quinn that the succession was taken up from Countess Markievicz. So men found it comfortable. Men were overwhelmingly, sometimes uniformly in positions of power and influence. And they were happy enough to keep a man's club, to keep politics, to keep other forms of activity dominated by men. And it meant that second-rate men could have an easy feeling of superiority over first-rate women simply because of their sex. So it lasted far longer than it should have done with New Zealand, as Catherine says, a pioneer in the 19th century. But it was a pattern way outside Ireland. In the Irish case, I think part of the reason why women in public life had a bad press was the fact that in the treaty debates, all the women opposed the treaty. Sometimes in the case of Mary McSweeney with people felt at excessive length. Certainly she spoke more than any other member of the Dáil. She covered more pages, filled more pages. And people like P.S. O'Hegarty were appalled at what they saw as the harpies, women showing that they are naturally extreme, they lack the balance of men, and it was easy for smug, sexist, complacent attitudes to dominate. And even for people like De Valera, who would naturally have welcomed and need the support of all the women in the Dáil, to feel more comfortable in a man's world. So it's a pattern that I think can be most easily explained, not just in the Irish context, in a wider international context as well, through selfishness, short-sightedness of men who got away with it for far too long.
Thanks very much. Catherine, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would also say that it really that it took a foundation, a bedrock of extraordinary women historians and researchers to begin to reassess and to rethink what we consider to be official archives as well. So people like Margaret McCurtain, just leading the way, beginning to open up at university level. I mean, when I went to Cambridge, there were still colleges in 1989, for instance, that still hadn't let women in. And so, it's this sense in which you're kind of questioning from within institutions, institutional kind of value systems as well. And I suppose that the 37 Constitution, that depressing document in which it says that women actually belong in the home, was something that in founding the Irish Women's Association in 1893, that Alice Milligan had also attempted to challenge as early as that, but she would turn up to meetings and, you know, by elite unionists and elite nationalists be told that she shouldn't be there. So even organisations that she helped to found, like the 1798 Commemoration Committee, she would turn up to a meeting and be told by senior nationalists that she shouldn't be there because she was a woman. And she would say, well, I'm not here as a woman, I'm here as a member of the press, because she had founded the two most important journals to come out of Belfast in the 19th century. So, yeah, it's difficult.
Donald, would you like to comment on the, perhaps the absence or perhaps the presence of women in the early GAA?
The Camogie Association was quite an early sort of parallel to the GAA, but it was quite revolutionary, I suppose, in the sporting context, and indeed had many disputes over whether men should be officials. It once had a national split in the 1930s about whether men could be officials at all. But in answer to the original question, I would also suggest, with deference to the greater experts in the women's history, that maybe she lived too long and didn't die a martyr like many of the other people involved in her contemporaries. And I know there was definitely the fact of her being a woman being written out of it, definitely, but compare her another person, another contemporary of hers who I would consider in such a light would be another UCD professor before Professor Laffin, George Sigerson, another Ulster man from Tyrone, who died at the age of 89, had contributed so much to Irish life in so many quarters, and is largely forgotten now for those many achievements because he outlived all of his contemporaries. Well, that's a very short, oversimplified way of it, but there's some truth in it. So that's just another theory to throw into the mix.